How was Chicago in 1820? Chapter 1: The Land Before the City. In 1820, Chicago was not a city, it was barely even a settlement. What we know today as one of America's greatest metropolises was, at that time, nothing more than a desolate, swampy frontier outpost at the edge of the known world. To understand Chicago in 1820, we must first erase every mental image of skyscrapers, bustling streets, and urban sprawl. Instead, picture an endless expanse of tall prairie grass swaying in the wind, punctuated by dense groves of oak and hickory trees, with marshland stretching as far as the eye could see. The geography of this place was both its curse and its destiny. The Chicago River, a sluggish, shallow waterway, meandered through the landscape before emptying into Lake Michigan. This river would later become the city's lifeline, but in 1820, it was simply another feature of the wetlands. The terrain was predominantly flat, broken only by low ridges of sand dunes along the lakeshore. During spring floods, much of the area became an impassable quagmire, with standing water covering the low-lying prairies for weeks or even months. The soil beneath this wilderness was extraordinarily rich, deposited over millennia by glacial activity. But in 1820, this fertility was largely irrelevant to the handful of people who called this place home. The land was too wet for extensive agriculture, and the growing season in this northern climate was short and unpredictable. Winter temperatures could plummet to dangerous lows, with Lake Michigan's moisture creating fierce snowstorms that could blanket the region in feet of snow overnight. The name Chicago itself came from the indigenous peoples who had inhabited this region for thousands of years. Most scholars believe it derives from a Miami, Illinois word, Chicaquah, referring to wild onions or garlic that grew abundantly in the marshy areas. The French fur traders who arrived in the 17th and 18th centuries adapted this to Chicago, or various similar spellings. By 1820, Chicago was becoming the standard English rendering, though the place it described was far from standardized. The strategic importance of this location had been recognized for centuries. Before 1820, Native American trails crisscrossed the region, connecting the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River watershed. The Chicago River and the nearby Des Plaines River came tantalizingly close to each other, separated by a low, marshy divide. During periods of high water, canoes could actually pass from one watershed to the other, creating a natural highway between Lake Michigan and the Illinois River, which flowed to the Mississippi. This portage route was the key to Chicago's future, though few could have imagined it in 1820. Lake Michigan itself dominated the landscape and the climate. This massive body of fresh water, one of the 5 Great Lakes, stretched northward beyond the horizon. Its deep blue waters were often choppy and dangerous, capable of generating waves that rivaled ocean swells during autumn storms. The lake moderated temperatures somewhat, keeping the immediate shoreline slightly warmer in winter and cooler in summer than areas just a few miles inland. But it also generated its own weather systems, including sudden squalls and dense fogs that could disorient travelers. The wildlife in 1820 was abundant beyond modern comprehension. The prairies teemed with animals. Massive herds of bison, though declining in number due to hunting pressure, still grazed on the grasslands. White-tailed deer were everywhere, along with elk in the more wooded areas. Wolves howled at night, and black bears wandered the oak groves. The wetlands were paradise for waterfowl. During migration seasons, the sky would darken with ducks and geese, their numbers so vast that their wing beats sounded like distant thunder. Passenger pigeons, which would be extinct within a century, flew in flocks so dense they could take hours to pass overhead. The rivers and lake were equally rich with life. Sturgeon, some measuring 6 feet or more in length, swam in the Chicago River and along the lakeshore. Pike, bass, and perch were abundant. In spring, fish runs were so heavy that Native Americans could harvest them with simple weirs and baskets. The marshes buzzed with insects during the warm months, including clouds of mosquitoes that made life miserable for anyone venturing into the wetlands. Vegetation varied with the terrain. The prairies were dominated by big bluestem, Indian grass, and other tall prairie species that could grow higher than a man's head by late summer. These grasslands were periodically swept by fires, some started by lightning, others deliberately set by Native Americans to manage the landscape and drive game. The fires prevented trees from establishing themselves on the prairies, maintaining the open character of the land. Where fires were less frequent, oak openings developed, park-like landscapes with scattered trees and shorter grasses. Along watercourses and in protected areas, dense forests grew, dominated by oak, hickory, maple, and elm. The seasons here were dramatic and unforgiving. Spring arrived late, often not until April or even May, with unpredictable freezes that could kill early vegetation. Summer brought heat and humidity, with temperatures sometimes soaring into the 90s Fahrenheit. Thunderstorms were frequent and often violent, with lightning, hail, and occasional tornadoes. Autumn was brief but spectacular, as the deciduous forests exploded in color before the leaves fell. Winter descended early and stayed late, with the first snows often arriving in November and the last not melting until March or even April. Lake Michigan rarely froze completely, but shore ice could extend out for hundreds of yards, and the lake effect created brutal winter conditions. This was the stage upon which the Chicago story was about to unfold, though in 1820 the drama had barely begun. Chapter 2: The Native Peoples and Their World. Long before any Europeans set foot in the Chicago area, this land belonged to the indigenous peoples who had made it their home for countless generations. By 1820, the dominant Native American presence in the region was the Potawatomi, though their claim to the area was relatively recent in historical terms. Understanding Chicago in 1820 requires understanding these people, their way of life, and the complex web of relationships that connected them to other tribes, to European traders, and to the expanding American nation. The Potawatomi were an Algonquian-speaking people who had migrated into the Great Lakes region from the east, possibly as early as the 15th or 16th century. By 1820, they controlled a vast territory stretching from what is now Wisconsin through Illinois and into Michigan and Indiana. They were closely related to the Ojibwa and Ottawa peoples, and together these three nations formed a loose confederation known as the Council of Three Fires. The Potawatomi were known among Europeans and Americans as generally friendly and accommodating, though they were also skilled warriors when circumstances required. The Potawatomi population in the Chicago area in 1820 was relatively small, perhaps a few hundred individuals spread across several villages and seasonal camps. Their largest permanent village near Chicago was located along the Des Plaines River, several miles from the mouth of the Chicago River. They also maintained fishing camps along the lakeshore and hunting camps in the interior prairies and forests. Their settlement patterns were seasonal, moving to take advantage of different resources throughout the year. The Potawatomi way of life in 1820 represented a complex blend of traditional practices and adaptations to European contact. Their economy was based on hunting, fishing, gathering, and agriculture, with the relative importance of each activity varying by season and location. In spring, they tapped maple trees for sugar, a practice they may have learned from Eastern tribes or developed independently. They also fished extensively during the spawning runs, catching and drying fish to store for later use. Women planted gardens of corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters that had sustained indigenous peoples across eastern North America for centuries. They also grew pumpkins and other crops introduced through trade networks. Summer was a time of relative plenty. While women tended the crops, men hunted deer, elk, and smaller game, and everyone gathered wild foods. The prairies and forests provided an abundance of berries, nuts, roots, and edible plants. The Potawatomi had intimate knowledge of the landscape and its resources, knowing where to find everything from medicinal herbs to materials for making tools and clothing. They gathered wild rice in the marshes, harvested nuts from the oak groves, and dug prairie turnips from the grasslands. Autumn was harvest season for the crops, but it was also the primary hunting season. As the weather cooled, the Potawatomi men organized communal hunts for bison, deer, and other large game. These hunts were elaborate affairs involving dozens of hunters working together to drive animals into areas where they could be killed efficiently. The meat was dried or smoked for winter storage, and the hides were processed for clothing and shelter. Nothing was wasted. Bones became tools, sinew became thread, organs, and other parts were used for various purposes. Winter was the most challenging season. The Potawatomi typically spent the coldest months in permanent villages located in sheltered areas near woods and water. They lived in wigwams, dome-shaped structures made by bending saplings into frames and covering them with bark or woven mats. These dwellings were surprisingly warm when properly constructed and heated with central fires. Families lived on stored food from the previous seasons, supplemented by hunting and ice fishing when weather permitted. This was also a time for storytelling, crafts, and spiritual ceremonies. By 1820, the Potawatomi had been in contact with Europeans for over a century and a half, and this contact had transformed their society in profound ways. Most significantly, they had become deeply involved in the fur trade. Beaver pelts, deer hides, and other furs could be traded for European-manufactured goods that made life easier or more comfortable. Metal knives, axes, and cooking pots were far superior to their stone and ceramic equivalents. Wool blankets were warmer and lighter than traditional robes. Glass beads became prized for decorative work. Guns had largely replaced bows and arrows for hunting and warfare, though this created a dependency on European traders for ammunition and repairs. This trade relationship had both benefited and harmed the Potawatomi. On one hand, it provided access to useful technologies and luxury goods. On the other hand, it created dependencies and disrupted traditional economies. The intensive hunting required to supply the fur trade depleted game populations, forcing hunters to range farther from their villages. The fur trade also brought alcohol, which had devastating effects on many Native American communities. By 1820, alcohol abuse was already a serious problem among some Potawatomi bands, contributing to social breakdown and making them more vulnerable to exploitation by unscrupulous traders. European diseases had also taken a terrible toll. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other infectious diseases swept through Native American populations repeatedly throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. The Potawatomi had no natural immunity to these diseases, and epidemics could kill half or more of a village's population in a matter of weeks. By 1820, the Potawatomi population was a fraction of what it had been before European contact, and the demographic collapse had disrupted traditional social structures and cultural practices. The political situation in 1820 was complex and increasingly precarious for the Potawatomi. Technically, they were at peace with the United States, having signed several treaties in the years following the War of 1812. However, these treaties had already cost them vast territories. The Treaty of St. Louis in 1816 had forced them to cede much of their land in Illinois, though they retained the right to hunt on these lands until they were settled by Americans. The Treaty of Chicago in 1821, which was about to be negotiated, would extract further concessions. The Potawatomi leadership in 1820 was divided between those who favored accommodation with the Americans and those who advocated resistance. Some chiefs, recognizing the overwhelming power of the United States, believed that cooperation and adaptation offered the best hope for survival. They encouraged their people to adopt American-style agriculture and other practices, hoping that by becoming civilized in American eyes, they could retain at least some of their homeland. Other leaders, often younger warriors, were more militant, arguing that the Americans would never be satisfied until all native lands were taken and all native peoples were dead or displaced. The spiritual life of the Potawatomi in 1820 was similarly complex. Traditional religious practices remained strong, centered on a belief in a creator deity, often called the Great Spirit in English, along with a host of lesser spirits that inhabited the natural world. Shamans served as religious leaders and healers, conducting ceremonies to ensure good hunting, successful crops, and community health. The Midewiwin, or Grand Medicine Society, was an important religious organization that preserved sacred knowledge and conducted healing rituals. However, Christianity was also making inroads. Catholic missionaries had been working among the Potawatomi since French colonial times, and some Potawatomi had converted, at least nominally. Protestant missionaries were also beginning to appear, seeing the native peoples as souls to be saved. Some Potawatomi syncretized Christian and traditional beliefs, creating unique hybrid practices. Others rejected Christianity entirely, seeing it as part of the American effort to destroy their culture. Warfare, while less common than in earlier periods, remained part of Potawatomi life in 1820. Traditional enemies included the Osage to the west, and sometimes the Sauk and Fox. The Potawatomi were generally allied with other Algonquian peoples and maintained friendly relations with the few American settlers and traders in the region. However, memories of the recent War of 1812 were still fresh. Many Potawatomi warriors had fought alongside the British against the Americans, and tensions remained. The Potawatomi social structure was organized around clans, with each clan tracing descent through the male line from a common ancestor, often associated with a particular animal or natural phenomenon. Clan membership determined whom one could marry and one's role in community ceremonies and governance. Leadership was earned through demonstrated wisdom, generosity, and success in hunting or warfare, rather than inherited. Chiefs had limited formal power and governed primarily through persuasion and consensus building. Family life was central to Potawatomi society. Gender roles were clearly defined but complementary. Men hunted, fished, fought, and engaged in diplomacy and trade. Women managed the household, raised children, tended crops, gathered wild foods, and processed animal hides and other materials. Elders were respected for their wisdom and experience, and children were raised permissively by modern standards, learning through observation and gentle guidance rather than harsh discipline. This was a society in transition, caught between a traditional way of life that had sustained them for centuries and an uncertain future dominated by American expansion. The Potawatomi in 1820 could not have known that within 2 decades they would be forcibly removed from their homeland, marched westward to Kansas in what would become known as the Trail of Death, but the warning signs were already visible for those willing to see them. Chapter 3: Fort Dearborn and the American Presence. The most prominent symbol of American authority in Chicago in 1820 was Fort Dearborn, a military installation that stood near the mouth of the Chicago River on its south bank. This fort represented the United States government's claim to the region and its determination to maintain a presence on the frontier, even in such an isolated and seemingly insignificant location. Understanding Fort Dearborn is essential to understanding Chicago in 1820, for the fort was, in many ways, Chicago itself, the only permanent American settlement in the area. Fort Dearborn had a brief but dramatic history before the 1820. The original fort had been constructed in 1803, following the establishment of American control over the Northwest Territory. The fort was named after Henry Dearborn, who was then serving as Secretary of War under President Thomas Jefferson. Its purpose was to maintain order among the Native American tribes, protect American interests in the fur trade, and assert American sovereignty over the strategic portage route between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River system. The original Fort Dearborn had been destroyed during the War of 1812 in one of the most tragic episodes in early Chicago history. As tensions between the United States and Britain escalated into war, Fort Dearborn became increasingly isolated and vulnerable. Native American tribes allied with the British controlled much of the surrounding territory, and the small American garrison, numbering perhaps 50 soldiers plus a handful of civilians, was cut off from reinforcements and supplies. In August 1812, orders arrived from Detroit to evacuate the fort and retreat to Fort Wayne in Indiana. The evacuation was a disaster. On August 15, 1812, as the soldiers, settlers, and their families marched south along the lakeshore, they were ambushed by a large force of Potawatomi warriors. The battle was brief and brutal. Approximately half of the Americans were killed, including many women and children. The survivors were taken prisoner, though most were eventually ransomed or escaped. The Potawatomi burned the abandoned fort, leaving nothing but charred ruins. This massacre, as Americans called it, left a legacy of bitterness and distrust that still poisoned relations between Americans and the Potawatomi in 1820. The Potawatomi saw the attack as a legitimate act of war. The Americans had allied with their enemies, occupied their land, and now were being driven out. The Americans saw it as a treacherous attack on defenseless civilians. Both perspectives contained elements of truth, but reconciliation was difficult. After the War of 1812 ended in 1815, the United States moved quickly to reassert its authority in the Northwest Territory. Among the priorities was rebuilding Fort Dearborn. Construction began in 1816 on a new fort, larger and more substantial than the original. By 1820, this rebuilt Fort Dearborn was the anchor of American presence in the Chicago area. The fort itself was a typical frontier military installation of the period. It was rectangular in shape, measuring approximately 100 feet by 100 feet, surrounded by a stockade of upright logs sharpened to points at the top. At two diagonal corners stood blockhouses, two-story structures with overhanging upper floors that allowed defenders to fire down on anyone attempting to breach the walls. The blockhouses also served as watchtowers, providing views of the surrounding countryside and the lake. Inside the stockade were several buildings. The barracks housed the enlisted men, while officers had separate quarters. There was a guardhouse, a magazine for storing gunpowder and ammunition, and various storage buildings for food and supplies. A parade ground occupied the center of the fort. The commandant's house was the most substantial structure, a frame building that also served as the administrative center of the post. Outside the stockade but nearby were additional structures, including a blacksmith shop, stables, and the agency house where the Indian agent lived. The garrison in 1820 typically numbered between 50 and 100 soldiers, depending on the availability of troops and the perceived threat level. These were regular army infantry, supplemented occasionally by artillery or other specialists. Life for these soldiers was monotonous and difficult. Military discipline was harsh by modern standards, with flogging still an authorized punishment for infractions. Pay was poor, food was mediocre at best, and opportunities for recreation were limited. Desertion was a constant problem, with soldiers sometimes slipping away to seek their fortunes elsewhere on the frontier. The officers were a mixed lot. Some were professional soldiers who had served in the War of 1812 or even earlier conflicts. Others were political appointees who had received their commissions through connections rather than merit. The quality of leadership at Fort Dearborn varied considerably depending on who was in command. A competent, energetic commander could maintain discipline and efficiency. An incompetent or lazy one could allow the post to deteriorate into disorder. The fort's military mission in 1820 was primarily defensive and symbolic. The soldiers drilled regularly, maintained their weapons, and stood watch, but actual combat was unlikely. The Potawatomi were at peace with the United States, and there were no other hostile forces in the region. The fort's real purpose was to demonstrate American power and sovereignty, to reassure traders and settlers, and to provide a base for the Indian agent. The Indian agent was a civilian official appointed by the federal government to manage relations with Native American tribes. In 1820, the agent at Chicago was responsible for distributing annuity payments promised to the Potawatomi and other tribes under various treaties, mediating disputes, and monitoring the activities of traders to prevent fraud and abuse. The position offered opportunities for both public service and private profit, and some agents were more honest than others. The government trading house, or factory as it was called, had operated at Fort Dearborn in earlier years as part of a federal program intended to provide Native Americans with fair prices for furs and manufactured goods, thereby reducing their dependence on private traders who often exploited them. However, this program was controversial and would be discontinued by Congress in 1822. By 1820, private traders had largely displaced the government factory anyway. The trader population at Chicago in 1820 was small but significant. These were men who purchased furs from Native American hunters and sold them manufactured goods in return. The most successful traders built long-term relationships with particular Native American families or bands, often marrying Native women and adopting aspects of Native culture. These marriages were both romantic and economic, creating kinship bonds that facilitated trade. The children of these unions, often called métis, would play important roles in the region's development. Several trading establishments operated in the vicinity of Fort Dearborn in 1820. These were typically crude log structures where traders stored their goods and conducted business. The most prominent trader was probably John Kinsey, who had been involved in the Chicago fur trade since before the War of 1812. Kinsey and his family lived in a house near the fort, one of the few civilian residences in the area. His wife, Eleanor Kinsey, would later write a memoir of frontier life that provides valuable insights into this period. The civilian population at Chicago in 1820 was minuscule, perhaps 2 or 3 dozen people at most, including traders, their families, and a few laborers and hangers-on. These people lived precarious lives, dependent on the fur trade for their livelihoods and on the fort for protection. They were a diverse lot, including American-born settlers, French Canadians whose families had been involved in the Great Lakes fur trade for generations, Métis of mixed native and European ancestry, and even a few African Americans, both free and enslaved. Relations between the military and civilian populations were sometimes strained. Soldiers resented civilians who seemed to profit from the frontier while the military protected them. Civilians complained about military regulations and the commandant's attempts to control trade and other activities. Conflicts over women, particularly Native American women, sometimes erupted into violence. Officers occasionally used their authority to favor certain traders or to punish those who crossed them. Fort Dearborn's material conditions in 1820 were primitive by Eastern standards. Supplies came by ship across Lake Michigan during the navigation season, which typically ran from April or May through October or November. In winter, the post was completely isolated, dependent on whatever had been stockpiled before ice closed the lake. Food supplies consisted mainly of salted pork, dried beans, flour, and whatever could be hunted or purchased from local Native Americans. Fresh vegetables and fruits were rare luxuries. Disease was a constant threat, with malaria particularly common due to the surrounding swamps. Communication with the outside world was irregular and slow. Mail might arrive every few weeks during summer, but months could pass between deliveries in winter. News from the east was always weeks or months out of date when it finally reached Chicago. The inhabitants of Fort Dearborn lived in a bubble of isolation, cut off from the larger currents of American life and politics. Despite its isolation and insignificance, Fort Dearborn represented the future. It was the beachhead of American expansion into the Great Lakes region, the first permanent American settlement in what would become one of the world's great cities. In 1820, however, that future was unimaginable. Chicago was nothing but a muddy frontier outpost, where a handful of soldiers and traders clung to existence on the edge of a vast wilderness. Chapter 4: Daily Life and Survival. Daily life in and around Chicago in 1820 was defined by the constant struggle for survival and the adaptation to a harsh and unforgiving environment. For the soldiers at Fort Dearborn, the traders and their families, and the Potawatomi, who were the original inhabitants, each day brought challenges that tested their endurance, ingenuity, and will to live. Understanding what daily existence was like provides crucial insight into the reality of Chicago before it became a city. For the soldiers garrisoned at Fort Dearborn, the day began early, typically at dawn or even before. A drum or bugle call would rouse the men from their bunks in the barracks. After dressing in their uniforms, blue wool coats, and trousers that were uncomfortable in both summer heat and winter cold, they would form up for morning roll call. The officer of the day would inspect the troops, checking that uniforms were reasonably clean and that each man had his musket and equipment in proper order. Breakfast for the soldiers was basic and monotonous. The standard military ration consisted of salt pork or beef, hardtack, a nearly indestructible flour and water biscuit, and perhaps beans or peas. Coffee was sometimes available, made from roasted beans when the supply held out, or from roasted grains when it did not. The food was prepared by company cooks, whose skills varied widely. Soldiers sometimes pooled their rations and cooked together to create something more palatable than the standard issue. After breakfast came the endless rounds of military duties. There were always guard posts to man, with soldiers standing 2-hour watches at the gates and corners of the stockade, scanning the prairie and forest for any sign of threat. Other men performed fatigue duty, cutting firewood, carrying water, cleaning the grounds, repairing buildings, and performing the countless other tasks necessary to maintain a frontier military post. The officers tried to keep the men busy, believing that idleness led to trouble. Military drill consumed several hours most days. The soldiers practiced the intricate formations and maneuvers of early 19th century infantry tactics, learning to move in precise ranks and files, to execute turns and wheels in unison, to load and fire their muskets in coordinated volleys. These drills were intended to prepare the soldiers for battle, though most of them would never actually fight. The drilling also served to instill discipline and to pass the time. For the officers, daily life was somewhat more comfortable, but no less tedious. They had their own quarters, which afforded more privacy and comfort than the crowded barracks. Officers' duties included inspecting the troops, maintaining paperwork and records corresponding with higher headquarters, and managing the post's operations. In the evenings, officers might gather in the mess for dinner and conversation, discussing politics, military affairs, or simply passing time with cards or other games. The traders and their families lived quite differently from the soldiers. Their daily routines were driven by the demands of commerce rather than military discipline. A trader might rise at dawn to greet Native American hunters arriving with furs. The process of trading was elaborate and ritualized. The trader would examine each pelt carefully, judging its quality and size, then negotiate a price. Payment was rarely in cash, which was scarce on the frontier. Instead, the trader would offer manufactured goods from his stock: blankets, knives, kettles, cloth, beads, and often alcohol. The trader's wife, if he had one, managed the household and often participated in the business. Women in these frontier trading families performed all the traditional domestic tasks: cooking, cleaning, sewing, and childcare, but they also frequently spoke native languages, helped keep accounts, and served as cultural intermediaries between their husbands and native customers. The children of these families grew up bilingual and bicultural, equally at home among Americans and native peoples. Food procurement was a central preoccupation for everyone at Chicago in 1820. The soldiers received government rations. Though these were often inadequate or of poor quality, civilians had to provide for themselves, which meant hunting, fishing, purchasing food from Native Americans, and in warmer months, maintaining small gardens. Hunting parties would venture out from the fort, seeking deer, waterfowl, or other game to supplement their diets. Fishing in the river and lake provided another important protein source, particularly during spawning runs when fish were abundant and easy to catch. Wild food supplemented cultivated crops. In season, there were berries to gather from the prairies, nuts from the oak groves, and various edible plants. The Potawatomi were experts at identifying and utilizing these resources, and the traders and soldiers learned from them. Maple sugar, processed in early spring from tree sap, was a valuable sweetener. Wild onions, the plant that gave Chicago its name, added flavor to bland meals. Water came from the Chicago River, or from wells dug within the fort. The river water was often muddy and had to be allowed to settle before use. In winter, ice could be cut from the frozen river or lake and melted. The quality of drinking water was highly variable, and waterborne diseases were common, though people did not understand the connection between water quality and illness. Clothing was practical rather than fashionable. Soldiers wore their uniforms while on duty, but often changed into civilian clothes or work dress when off duty. Traders and frontiersmen typically wore a mix of American and native clothing, perhaps a cloth shirt and wool trousers, but also moccasins and a buckskin jacket. Native styles were often more practical for frontier conditions than American fashions designed for eastern cities. Women's clothing was similarly practical, with sturdy dresses, shawls, and moccasins being common. Washing clothes was an arduous task, particularly in winter, when water had to be heated over fires. Soap, when available, was often homemade from rendered animal fat and wood ash. Clothes were scrubbed on washboards and hung to dry, weather permitting. In winter, wet clothes might freeze solid before they could dry. Personal hygiene was minimal by modern standards, bathing was infrequent, and many frontier people went months between baths during the winter. Medical care was primitive and often ineffective. The fort had a surgeon, but his training might be minimal and his treatments based on outdated theories. Bloodletting, purging, and dosing with mercury and other toxic substances were standard treatments that probably killed as many patients as they cured. Most people relied on home remedies and Native American herbal medicine, which was often more effective than what the fort surgeon could provide. Childbirth was particularly dangerous, with no modern obstetric care available. Women died in childbirth with tragic frequency, and infant mortality was horrifically high. Entertainment and recreation were limited, but important for maintaining morale. Soldiers gambled with cards or dice, despite regulations against it. They told stories, sang songs, and occasionally staged amateur theatrical performances. Alcohol consumption was ubiquitous and problematic. The army issued a daily ration of whiskey to soldiers, and civilians had easy access to liquor through the traders. Drunkenness was common and led to fights, accidents, and disciplinary problems. For the Potawatomi living in the vicinity, daily life followed very different patterns, governed by the seasons and traditional practices. In spring, families would disperse to maple sugar camps, tapping trees and boiling sap into sugar. As the weather warmed, women would prepare garden plots, using hoes to break the soil and plant corn, beans, and squash. Men would fish and begin hunting as game emerged from winter. Summer was a time of intensive work for Potawatomi women, tending crops, gathering wild foods, and processing materials for clothing, shelter, and tools. Men hunted, traded, and engaged in diplomacy or warfare as circumstances required. Children helped with appropriate tasks and played games that developed skills they would need as adults. Evenings might be spent around fires, with storytelling, singing, and socializing. Autumn brought harvest time, with families gathering to collect corn and other crops. This was also the main hunting season, when men would organize communal hunts for large game. The meat and hides from these hunts had to be processed and stored for winter. Families would gradually move toward their winter villages, located in sheltered areas with access to firewood and water. Winter was a time of relative inactivity, with families living largely indoors in their wigwams, sustained by stored food. Men might ice fish or hunt when weather permitted, but travel and outdoor work were minimized. This was a time for crafts, storytelling, spiritual ceremonies, and social bonding within the village. Throughout the year, for all the people living in and around Chicago in 1820, life was precarious. A bad harvest, a harsh winter, an outbreak of disease, an accident, any of these could spell disaster. There was no social safety net, no emergency services, no modern medicine. People survived through their own efforts, through mutual aid within their communities, and through sheer luck. Death was a constant presence, particularly for the young and old. Life expectancy was perhaps 40 years at best, and many children died before reaching adulthood. Yet despite the hardships, life also had its satisfactions. The landscape, for all its harshness, had a wild beauty that could stir the soul. Human connections, family bonds, friendships, community ties provided meaning and support. There was freedom here that was unavailable in more settled regions. The future, for those who thought about it, seemed full of possibility. Chicago in 1820 was a hard place to live, but it was also a place where determined people could make a life on their own terms. Chapter 5: Commerce, Communication, and Connections to the Wider World. Despite its isolation and tiny population, Chicago in 1820 was not completely cut off from the rest of the world. A web of economic, political, and social connections linked this remote frontier outpost to other settlements in the Great Lakes region, to American cities on the East Coast, and even to Europe. Understanding these connections is crucial to understanding both how Chicago survived and how it was positioned for future growth. The fur trade was the economic lifeblood of Chicago in 1820. This commerce had driven European and American interest in the Great Lakes region for 2 centuries, and it remained the primary reason for maintaining a presence at Chicago. The mechanics of the fur trade were complex, involving multiple layers of exchange and transportation across vast distances. At the most basic level, Native American hunters trapped or shot animals, primarily beaver, but also muskrat, otter, mink, fox, and deer, and processed their pelts. These furs were then traded to frontier traders, like those at Chicago, in exchange for manufactured goods. The traders accumulated these furs and, when they had collected a sufficient quantity, shipped them to larger trading posts or directly to eastern markets. The most efficient transportation route was by boat across Lake Michigan to Mackinac Island, a major fur trade entrepot at the straits between Lakes Michigan and Huron. From Mackinac, furs were transported to Detroit, Buffalo, or Montreal, depending on the trading company's connections and preferences. From these cities, they were shipped to New York, Philadelphia, or other Atlantic ports. Finally, many American furs were exported to Europe, particularly to London, where they were processed into felt for hats or used for other luxury goods. A beaver pelt taken by a Potawatomi hunter near Chicago might end up as a gentleman's hat in London after a journey of thousands of miles and passage through a dozen different hands. This long commercial chain meant that events far away could affect Chicago dramatically. Changes in European fashion could alter the demand and price for particular types of furs. Economic depressions in eastern cities could reduce the market for furs and the availability of manufactured goods to trade. Wars or trade disruptions could sever the connection entirely. The people at Chicago in 1820 were participants in a global economy, though they might never travel more than a few hundred miles from where they were born. The manufactured goods that traders offered in exchange for furs came through the same network in reverse. Textiles from New England mills, metal goods from Pennsylvania foundries, gunpowder from Eastern manufacturers, and imported items from Europe all made their way west through the Great Lakes to remote posts like Chicago. The markup at each stage was substantial, so prices at Chicago were far higher than in eastern cities. A blanket that cost a few dollars in New York might trade for several prime beaver pelts at Chicago, representing a considerable profit for the middlemen. Transportation in 1820 was primitive and uncertain. Water routes were far superior to overland travel, which is why Chicago's location at the junction of the Great Lakes and Mississippi River watersheds gave it strategic importance. During the navigation season, which typically lasted from April or May through October or November, ships could reach Chicago from the east via the Great Lakes. These vessels were mostly schooners and sloops, relatively small sailing ships that could navigate the lakes and enter harbors with limited depth. A voyage from Detroit to Chicago might take several days to a week, depending on wind and weather. Lake Michigan could be treacherous, with sudden storms generating dangerous waves. Shipwrecks were common, and every voyage carried risk. There were no lighthouses on the western shore of Lake Michigan in 1820, and navigation relied on charts of varying accuracy, the captain's skill, and considerable luck. In winter, when ice closed the lakes, Chicago was effectively isolated. Overland travel was theoretically possible, but the distances were vast and the conditions brutal. The few trails that existed were barely maintained, and much of the terrain was swampy and nearly impassable, except when frozen solid. A determined traveler with snowshoes or a dog sled might make the journey, but it was dangerous and exhausting. Most people simply hunkered down and waited for spring. Mail service to Chicago was irregular at best. There was no regular postal route to such a remote location. Correspondence might be carried by travelers, military couriers, or ship captains as a favor or for a fee. A letter sent from Chicago to New York might take weeks or months to arrive, and the sender might wait an equal time for a reply. Important news: the election of a president, the passage of significant legislation, even wars and disasters, reached Chicago long after the events occurred. This isolation meant that the people at Chicago in 1820 lived in a kind of temporal bubble, where their information about the world was always outdated. They made decisions based on old news, not knowing what had changed in the intervening weeks or months. Traders might ship furs to market, not knowing that prices had collapsed. Soldiers received orders that were obsolete before they arrived. Everyone speculated about what was happening in the wider world, but solid information was rare. Despite these limitations, Chicago was connected to a broader network of frontier settlements around the Great Lakes. Detroit, the territorial capital of Michigan Territory, was the nearest substantial American town, with a population of several thousand. Mackinac Island was an important trading center. Green Bay, at the head of Lake Michigan's northwestern bay, had a small but established settlement of traders and soldiers. These communities maintained regular contact when travel was possible, sharing news, trading goods, and providing mutual support. Chicago's political connection to the wider world ran through these administrative channels. In 1820, Chicago was technically part of Illinois, which had become a state in 1818. However, the state government in Vandalia, the capital, was hundreds of miles away and had little practical influence over such a remote corner of the state. More relevant were military and federal channels. Fort Dearborn reported to the commander of the Department of the West, military orders came from distant headquarters, and the Indian agent answered to the Federal Office of Indian Affairs. Economic connections extended beyond the fur trade. The Army garrison at Fort Dearborn represented a small but significant infusion of federal money into the local economy. The soldiers' pay, though meager, could be spent at the trading posts. The fort needed supplies, which created opportunities for contractors and freighters. The government payroll for soldiers, officers, and civilian employees represented one of the few sources of cash money in the area. Cultural connections were limited but important. Books and newspapers occasionally arrived, providing windows into Eastern society and culture. Officers and educated civilians might receive journals, pamphlets, or books from correspondents in the East. These materials were read avidly and shared among the literate population. Religious materials, including Bibles, prayer books, and denominational publications, helped maintain spiritual connections to home communities. Letters from family and friends preserved emotional bonds across the distance. The Native American populations also maintained their own networks of connection across vast territories. The Potawatomi were part of a larger Algonquian cultural sphere that extended across the Great Lakes and beyond. News traveled along native trade routes and through networks of kinship and alliance. When important events occurred, a major treaty negotiation, a significant battle, the death of an important chief, the news would spread through Indian country via runners and word of mouth, often faster than information traveled through American channels. Religious connections were minimal in Chicago. In 1820, there was no church building and no resident minister or priest. Religious services, when they occurred, were held by visiting clergy or by literate laypeople reading from prayer books or the Bible. Catholic missionaries occasionally visited the Potawatomi, continuing a tradition that dated back to French colonial times. Protestant circuit riders might pass through, preaching to whoever would listen, but organized religion had little presence or influence in this frontier community. Educational connections were similarly weak. There was no school at Chicago in 1820. Children of the traders and soldiers learned what their parents could teach them, which was often very little. Literacy rates were probably quite low among the frontier population, though some traders and all the officers would have been able to read and write. The Potawatomi had no written language and maintained their culture through oral tradition. Formal education was something that happened far away, in eastern cities and towns, not on the frontier. Medical knowledge and practices at Chicago were largely disconnected from the developing medical science of the period. The fort surgeon might have some formal training, but he was isolated from medical schools, journals, and the latest treatments. Most medical care was based on folk remedies, Native American herbalism, and outdated theories. The concept of germ theory would not be developed for several more decades, so people had no understanding of how diseases spread or could be prevented. These limited connections meant that Chicago in 1820 existed in a kind of twilight zone, not completely isolated, but far from fully integrated into American society. The people here were aware of the wider world, and participated in global commerce through the fur trade, but their daily lives were shaped more by immediate local conditions than by distant events. They were Americans, but their American experience was vastly different from that of people living in Boston, Philadelphia, or New York. They inhabited a frontier zone where American, Native American, and even residual French-Canadian influences mixed and competed, creating a unique hybrid culture that would not survive long into the future. Chapter 6: The Seeds of Transformation. In 1820, Chicago was barely more than a muddy portage route with a small fort and a handful of inhabitants. Yet within this unpromising landscape lay the seeds of transformation that would turn this wilderness outpost into one of the world's great cities. Understanding these latent possibilities helps explain how and why Chicago's future would be so dramatically different from its present. The single most important factor in Chicago's future was geography. The site's strategic location had been recognized for centuries, but its full potential would only be realized with technological and economic changes that were already beginning to unfold in 1820. The connection between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River system via the Chicago Portage represented a natural transportation corridor across the heart of the continent. Native Americans had used this route for generations, and French explorers and traders had recognized its significance in the 17th and 18th centuries. What would transform this ancient portage route into an economic powerhouse was the canal. Already in 1820, visionary thinkers were proposing the construction of an artificial waterway to connect the Chicago River with the Des Plaines River, thereby creating a direct water link between Lake Michigan and the Illinois River. This canal would eliminate the need to portage goods over the marshy divide and would allow boats to travel continuously from the Atlantic Ocean via the Great Lakes, through Chicago, down the Illinois and Mississippi rivers to the Gulf of Mexico. The idea was not new. Louis Joliet, the French explorer, had proposed such a canal in 1673, but in 1820, the technology and economic incentives were beginning to align to make it feasible. The spectacular success of the Erie Canal, then under construction in New York State, was demonstrating that artificial waterways could be built through difficult terrain and could generate enormous economic benefits. If New York could connect the Hudson River to Lake Erie with a canal, Illinois could surely connect the Great Lakes to the Mississippi. Congress had already shown interest in the concept. The Act of 1816 that created the state of Illinois included provisions granting land to the state for the purpose of building a canal connecting the Illinois River with Lake Michigan. The canal right-of-way passed directly through Chicago. This federal support meant that, even though the actual construction of the Illinois and Michigan Canal would not begin until 1836 and would not be completed until 1848, the groundwork was being laid in 1820. The second major seed of transformation was the land itself. The rich prairie soils surrounding Chicago would prove extraordinarily productive once they were drained and cultivated. In 1820, these prairies were viewed as obstacles. The grass was too tough for plows, the soil too wet for farming, the lack of trees a disadvantage for settlers who needed wood for building and fuel. But new technologies, particularly the steel plow developed by John Deere in the 1830s, would make prairie farming feasible. When that happened, the agricultural potential of the Midwest would be unleashed, and Chicago would become the natural marketplace for all this production. The third seed of transformation was political and demographic. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 and subsequent legislation had established a framework for the orderly survey and sale of Western lands, the creation of new territories and states, and the displacement of Native American populations. Although the process was often chaotic and brutal, it created conditions for rapid American expansion into the Old Northwest. Illinois had achieved statehood in 1818, and its population was growing rapidly through immigration from the eastern states and from Europe. This demographic flood had not yet reached Chicago in 1820. But it was coming. The removal of Native American tribes from their lands, either through treaties that were often coercive and fraudulent or through outright force, would open vast territories for American settlement. The Potawatomi and other tribes still controlled most of the land around Chicago in 1820, but their position was becoming increasingly untenable. Within 2 decades, they would be gone, and their lands would be available for American farmers and speculators. The fourth seed was technological. The transportation revolution was beginning to gather momentum in 1820. Steamboats were already operating on western rivers and on the Great Lakes, though they had not yet reached Chicago. These vessels, powered by steam engines rather than wind or current, could move faster and more reliably than sailing ships. They could also travel upstream against river currents, opening up two-way commerce on waterways that had previously been limited to downstream traffic. When steamboats began regular service to Chicago, which would happen in the late 1820s and early 1830s, the city's accessibility would increase dramatically. The railroad, which would ultimately prove more important than canals or steamboats, was still in its infancy in 1820. The first American railroad would not be chartered until 1827, and railroad technology was primitive and unreliable, but the concept was being developed. And within a generation, railroads would crisscross the continent, with Chicago emerging as the greatest railroad hub in the world. The first railroad to reach Chicago would arrive in 1848, the same year the Illinois and Michigan Canal opened. And from that point forward, Chicago's growth would accelerate exponentially. The fifth seed was economic. American capitalism in the early 19th century was dynamic and expansive, driven by entrepreneurship, speculation, and an appetite for risk. The market economy was spreading into the western frontier, monetizing resources and landscapes that had previously existed outside the cash nexus. The fur trade was already part of this process, but it was just the beginning. Land speculation, in particular, would become a dominant force in Chicago's development. The anticipation of future value drove investors to purchase land at Chicago years before there was any actual development, betting that the strategic location would eventually generate wealth. Many of these speculators would be proven right beyond their wildest dreams. The sixth seed was cultural and ideological. The doctrine of manifest destiny, though not yet known by that name in 1820, was taking shape in American consciousness. Americans increasingly believed that their nation was destined to expand across the continent, spreading Republican government and American civilization from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This ideology provided justification for the dispossession of native peoples and the aggressive pursuit of territorial expansion. Chicago, positioned at the edge of the frontier, would be swept up in this expansionist tide. The seventh seed was timing. Chicago's development coincided with broader transformations in American and global economies. The Industrial Revolution was accelerating, creating demand for agricultural products and raw materials. Urban populations in Europe and the eastern United States were growing rapidly, creating markets for Midwestern wheat and meat. The development of new food preservation techniques, particularly refrigeration, would allow Chicago to become a center for processing and shipping perishable goods. All these trends would converge at Chicago, turning its geographic advantages into economic reality. Yet, in 1820, none of this was apparent to the handful of people living at Chicago. They could not foresee the city of millions that would rise on this spot. They could not imagine the stockyards, the grain elevators, the skyscrapers, the railroads. They were simply trying to survive another day, another winter, another year on a harsh frontier. The future that was latent in Chicago's geography and position would take decades to unfold, and many of the people living at Chicago in 1820 would not survive to see it. For the Potawatomi, the seeds of transformation meant displacement and destruction. The same forces that would make Chicago great would destroy their way of life and drive them from their homeland. The Treaty of Chicago in 1833 would force them to cede all their remaining lands in Illinois and agree to removal west of the Mississippi. Thousands of Potawatomi would be marched westward in 1838 in what became known as the Trail of Death, with hundreds dying along the way. The survivors would rebuild their lives in Kansas and Oklahoma, but they would never return to Chicago. For the American settlers and speculators who would arrive in the coming decades, the seeds of transformation represented opportunity. Those who purchased land early and held it would become wealthy. Those who established businesses as the city grew would prosper. The entrepreneurs who recognized Chicago's potential and acted on it would shape the city's development and reap enormous rewards. But for every winner, there would be losers, speculators who bought at the wrong time.